Welcome to the Reason in Theology Show, everyone. I'm your host, Michael Lofton, joined here by returning guest, Dr. Matthew Meinert, who's going to be delivering his second lecture here in the Prima Pars series of St. Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologiae. But first, let me go ahead and just greet you to the show. Welcome back. How are you, Dr. Meinert?
I'm very well. It's good to be here with you. It's a nice warm day, even in Appalachia. So it's, I'm already, the spirits are already flowing. Let's hope that they go through the evening here.
Over here, it's kind of weird. At one moment, it will be really cold and you need to get long sleeves, and another moment, it's really hot and you got to go back to short sleeves, and then we do that all day long. So.
Yeah, well, I assure you, this week finally my injury is gone. So
It's gone.
I am in. It's slacked.
There we go. So if you have to get up and grab a book, we can actually.
I can do it. Okay, exactly. Good. I don't have to have the embarrassment of trying to use my chair as something to hide me.
Good deal. Well, let's go ahead and jump in. I'm just going to give you the floor. Let's see what you have.
All right. Well, so hopefully those of you who are listening were able to maybe go back and watch the first lecture I gave on an introduction to the Prima Pars and on an introduction to the whole cursus of theology as it's presented in St. Thomas Aquinas. As I said in the last lecture, I'm going to present this content really from within the school that I've learned from. I mean, of course, I've not read every book on my wall, but I'm very influenced by the Thomist school as a whole. People like Reginald Garrigou-Lagrange, Jean-Hervé Nicolas, Ambroise Gardet, Charles Journet, Yves Simon, Jacques Maritain, all of these folks and others who kind of carried on in the modern period discussions that really have been going on for centuries. So this is going to be a bit of my own synthesis because we can't just trace through the Summa as though theology has never developed. But what I'm presenting here, I hope, is a kind of Thomistic synthesis in the form of a 1-hour lecture. Last time we talked about the structure of theological science and the fact that the Prima Pars really is just one part of an entire arch of theology that treats primarily and centrally God in his inner life. And that's especially here in these lectures 2 and 3, what we're going to be discussing. And then the entire order of what the Greek fathers would call the economy, the salvation history, the economy of salvation history that plays its way out through all creatures coming from God, the moral life and spiritual life is articulated in the Secunda Pars, and then, of course, in the very, the culmination of Revelation, that is the incarnation, lived out then through the sacraments in the church's life. So today we're jumping into the Prima Pars. As I said, my approach to the text of St. Thomas is to look at it as primarily theological. So I'm sure that some of our listeners may not share the exact same faith presuppositions as what I do and what the Reason in Theology folks do. But there's a lot of philosophy embedded in here. But at times it's going to feel like it's moving quickly because St. Thomas is doing theology. And so philosophy is being used as an instrument. But the instrument can be critiqued. The instrument can be considered. There is such a thing as a Christian and Catholic philosophy. That's a somewhat contentious topic, but there is a philosophy that is legitimately that of reason alone. And we're going to feel its presence in our discussions here. And I welcome questions on that. So today we're going to talk about a treatise or a sub-treatise, really, of the Prima Pars, namely the treatment of God considered as one. Historically, this treatise, which encompasses questions 2 all the way up through question 26 of the Prima Pars, came to be known in some scholastic circles, especially, I think it's definitely solidifies by the 19th century. I can't remember if it goes back into the 18th century off the top of my head, but you'll find this all the way up to the time of the Second Vatican Council. It became known as the treatise on the one God. And then it would be followed by a separate treatise on the triune God. For good reason, I think that it's better to see actually the entire Prima Pars as the treatise on God, but if nothing else, to see the treatise on the one God and the treatise on the triune God is actually connected as a single treatise, De Deo. And then we're going to consider today de Deo ut uno, God considered as one. Or we could also say God considered with regard to those attributes that can be known of him through reason, yes, but also through revelation, as applying to the essence of God as a whole. Because as we'll see in our discussions in our next lecture, there's the whole question of then what we do about that which is proper to each of the persons and how the persons are related to the divine essence. They aren't distinct, even though the persons are distinct from each other. But today we're considering God considered as a whole, as one. I want to start, actually, I'm letting my mind go a teeny bit here, but I'm trying to synthesize. I want to start with something, though, that's an interesting question, an open matter. Who is this one God that we're speaking of? Is God, for instance, in the Old Testament, revealed as the one and triune God, just we don't know that he's triune? Or is it God the Father that is revealed in the Old Testament? And this will hopefully provide us with an entree point for our discussions here today, maybe the right theological outlook. There are some thinkers, I'd have to go flipping through them. Karl Rahner was among these, but there are others as well, and they don't have quite the same stink around their name that poor Karl Rahner does. Rahner's a mixed bag. People should be careful and not always quickly throw him under the bus, even though he's got problems in him. But certain thinkers who held that in the Old Testament, what we're dealing with is the person of God the Father. I'm of the school of thought that I think is correct on this, that the Father cannot be known without the Son, that this is a New Testament datum, that the Son, as related to the Father, reveals the Father as related to him. And so the God of the Old Testament should be considered as, yes, a personal God, but a God whose tri-personal character still remains mysterious. That when we consider the revelation of God on Mount Sinai, for instance, the famous line, that I am he who is, or I am who am, that this reveals to the people of Israel, and then it develops throughout the ongoing history of monotheism in Israel, an awareness of a truly personal God. This is obvious, really, from Genesis's earliest pages, that we're dealing with a personal God, but whose tri-personal identity has not yet been revealed, has not been, we could say, opened up. So we don't see the way that God is uniquely personal. So personality, or being personal, we could say, is in a sense essential to God, although immediately we see that person can only be attributed to each of the three relations that are the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. But that's our discussion for next week. But this gives us an idea of how it is that we can talk about the divine essence as a whole. Because God, in his relationship with the world, will always act as all three persons. There's an old maxim that runs that all of the activities of God outside of his being, to the degree we can use this kind of spatial language, are always involving the essence of God as a whole, the three persons together. That does not mean that the Father, the Son, and the Spirit are not uniquely present to creation, and also especially to those who are given grace. But it means that they are altogether related. And so this is, for instance, plays out in Christology even, that the creating and assumption of the human nature of Christ, drawing it to the Word, the second person of the Trinity, that whole activity is, however, the activity of the whole of the Trinity. Okay, well, that's just playing out this idea of considering God as kind of the whole. Well, let's think about the structure of this section that I probably will accidentally call De Deo Uno, or on the one God, but this section on God as one. It opens up with a question, famous, on the existence of God and its provability. The second question, and we will address this here shortly. But then it proceeds very carefully, because Aquinas is following the order of what the posterior analytics of Aristotle would say a science should do, through the essential attributes of God, and then what is called in a clunky Latinization, the operative attributes of God, or we could say the activity-oriented attributes of God. So his knowledge and his willing, or his knowledge or his intelligence and his intellect, his will and his willing, and then the various attributes that follow from that. So we're going to try and just work through the big structural bones of this. And I'm going to actually approach it from the question of the divine simplicity. So I'm going to give a primer, ultimately, on what one could call the way that the divine attributes are reconciled with each other. But let's begin, because it's always important to start with the famous 5 ways and the kind of questions that surround it. In question 2 of the Prima Pars. So famously, and here we are, here I'm gonna engage in a little bit of direct exegesis, or a little bit of direct text discussion, because so many listeners are probably going to be interested in this. So the question opens with, there are 3 articles. The first being, is the proposition God exists self-evident? This sounds strange, but let's think within a Christian mindset. Because St. Thomas is thinking like a Christian, and also, too, someone like St. Anselm in his famous argument that ultimately we can see that it's necessary that God exists, almost through an intuition of the fact that he is the greatest being that can be thought of. That they're thinking within the perspective of faith. That clearly their outlook is one that already presupposes the faith datum, that God exists, that God is the Savior. Well, from within this Christian context, also connected to certain things, actually, interestingly, from the beginning of the physics of Aristotle, actually, about how certain things are more known to us first, and then they're eventually more knowable. This question arose that was rather famous in the 13th century about, is it possible, actually, that God is the first thing that we know? Because, especially as they read Aristotle's treatise on the soul, if our mind is tuned to being, if what the mind, the intellect does is tune us to knowing the essences of things, one might say, above all, the being of things, how is it not impossible that, well, technically hidden in that very notion of being already, kind of driving our mind, is a sort of premonition of God? An Augustinian would see this and say, indeed, all of our desires bear witness to this, because we desire everything, even that which we deludedly convince ourselves of is right, even though it's evil. We desire it all from the perspective of that which is good. Well, that good is infinite in its breadth, because I could desire anything as good. There's a kind of seed within our will that drives us onward restlessly toward God, as that famous line goes from the Confessions, that our hearts are restless until they rest in you, O Lord. Well, a Christian who comes then with this bit of Aristotelianism, this various forms of this Augustinian insight, and then also, too, just the knowledge of God by faith that he exists, is going to ask, well, it seems that if I know God, I know the notion of God, he has to exist, because existence would be necessary for so perfect a being. Another way to put it is, God exists by his very essence. This is something that's revealed to Moses. So if I can fashion the idea of God, well, then I already actually implicitly know that he exists. Now, we can rehearse, if we so desire, in the questions, the form that this takes in St. Anselm. But I think it's important here to see more fundamentally, when we're thinking as kind of Thomists with a hat on, trying to do Thomism, that St. Thomas's entire approach just does not start with that kind of that sort of noetic, that sort of epistemology. The epistemology that St. Thomas ends up taking from Aristotle, which is rather sane and down to earth, to be honest, is merely that our very first grasp of things is tied to our experience in the world. That even whenever we consider something like being, our first touch on being, our first articulation of causality actually occurs by knowledge of just change and motion that we see in sensible things. The later Thomist school, though based on St. Thomas's texts, would speak of this as being the first degree of abstraction. That we're not talking about this or that case of change. I'm not talking about this person getting fatter, that celestial body moving, or anything else. There are many different types of change. Rather, I'm talking about change itself, universally considered as happening in any particular case. And so the intellect puts us in touch with that as our first known domain of knowledge. Now, there's many differentiations here, of course, but let's keep it simple. So we've got this initial grasp, for instance, of the being of changeable things. And we have this toolbox of Aristotle's notions of causality. And on the basis of these basic facts, St. Thomas lays out famously here in the third question or third article of this question, various ways to demonstrate God's existence. He does not presuppose that we have an intuitive knowledge of God kind of pre-built into us. He rather starts with the very basics, the basic experiential datum, that there's just a changing world out there. And this is why really his first way is presented as being the most obvious of them all. That if you presuppose a case of change, no matter what it is, change is always, when it's motion, it's a kind of imperfect actuality. So let's think about what that means. Just to take a simple example, whenever I've got my old person, as my friends joke with me, my heated water here to help keep my throat clear. As you heat something like water, you're always in the process of trying to get it to go to its terminal point of being fully heated. But it's never quite there. It's on the way. So it's in act. It's not just cool. It's not just potentially warm. It's on its way to being fully hot, but it's in kinesis. It's in motion toward being fully hot. Now, the interesting thing about the world is that, in sensible material realities, as soon as you hit hot, it then starts to change back to cool. See, things change quite a bit. It's very rare to find a case where you actually get to a place where it's always hot. Now, what would be an example of a contrast here? Let's consider, for example, the life cycle of an animal. The life cycle of an animal, from the beginning to the end of its life, involves many changes: digestion, sensation, desire, defecation, all sorts of things. But through that whole process, it's always living the life of, for example, a dachshund. There's never a time, so long as it lives, that it's not doing the activity of being a dachshund. It's living the life form of being a particular kind of animal. That is considered energeia. That is considered a true act. The form is the act of that entire life cycle. Very different than motion. Motion is imperfect act. It's on the way, but not there. Well, we could come up with other examples, but this is the basic structure then of the argument form in Article 3. And so he says it is the more manifest and first way that he's going to prove this. And I'm just going to take the text here. So he says it's certain and evident to our senses, that it's just a basic bit of datum, that in the world, some things are in motion. We experience this imperfect act that is motion. Now, whatever is in motion is put in motion by another, or the maxim, quid movitur ab alio movitur. Whatever is moved by another. This is one of these maxims of the Middle Ages. Another way to put it is that the change from potential to actual is not self-explanatory. That there's something giving this structure that's moving toward, this actualization that's moving toward being an act. And so, because this is needed, you need some previous cause. Now, this is where we get immediately into all the technicalities that really I know that I'm punting on and books have been written on. This process can't go on to infinity. He does not mean that it can't go on infinitely into the past, that it's impossible for there to be a long and infinite chain of causes in the past, but rather vertically, basically, there must be ultimately some source of actuality. That if you consider motion abstractly as the passage from potency to act, that although you could have an infinite series of, one in the past, and the past, and the past, and the past, continuing to be the cause of this actualization, you have to have ultimately vertically an explanation outside of this causal series that is purely act. And he says that's what's called God. Well, he's running this argument very quickly at the beginning of a theological treatise. This is the sort of thing that takes Aristotle the entirety of the metaphysics to do. And so I think it's important to see this fact and not underrate the fact that St. Thomas is arguing from within faith. He's very quickly using philosophy to make his point. And it's for this reason that someone like Father Reginald Garrigou-Lagrange writes 2 very big volumes. I mean, it's 1 volume in French, but it took 2 big volumes in English to translate on these proofs for God's existence and all of the philosophy that's involved in it. St. Thomas presents very similar arguments then, one using the notion of efficient causality, which is related to this idea of a cause giving act to what it causes. He discusses the dependence of all contingent being on an ultimate necessary being. He also has an argument that's very Platonic about the way that finite cases of, for example, beauty, very much like Plato's Symposium, one thinks, or finite goodness, the goodness of particular moral actions, the goodness of particular institutions, the goodness of particular works of art, etc., ultimately point to a first and pure case of goodness. It takes a lot to develop that argument, actually. It's presented here very quickly. And then finally, he gives his 5th way, that the fact that things are ordered to a particular end, the fact that we could say that particular beings, human life, dog life, trees, etc., have their own internal logic, their own internal teleology, their own internal end structure. They do things for the sake of an end. That this also points to a first cause who would have given them that intelligibility, that would have given them that order, that the entire life cycle of the tree has this intelligible structure that must come from him who all call God. Well, okay, that's rather quick. And so I'm going to leave it there. I'm aware of how much more one could say, and I'm sure that I'll get some questions. But you have to presuppose that he has in his mind the entire corpus of Aristotle and an entire elaboration of the Aristotelian metaphysics, as well as the physics and the De Anima, the treatise on the soul. All of that's in the background here. Well, okay, so that's a little bit dry, and as you could tell from my last presentation, I like to take theology and have it inspire to a degree, right? Because we're talking about the highest realities here, and I don't want this to be mere philosophy. And so I want to take us on a bit of a ride through the question of divine simplicity. St. Thomas treats, in several cases here in the articles on the one God, of God's simplicity. Immediately after the proofs for God's existence, he discusses God's simplicity. And then also, too, it's interesting, right before where we're going to be kind of driving here in Articles 12 and 13, he comes back to God's unity. But so let's just consider the articles that he's going to discuss And then we're going to move along, and I'm going to just take them all and combine them. And then feel free to ask questions. And I've also told Michael to make sure that he asks questions at the end too, if he thinks that you would benefit from certain points. St. Thomas in Article 3 discusses the divine simplicity. He then deals with the question of God's perfection, then goodness in general. So he has to kind of do some finessing work philosophically on the notion of goodness, and then God as the highest good. Then he discusses the divine infinity, God's omnipresence, his causal presence in all things, but he also has a presence through grace and a presence ultimately in the highest form through the union with Christ, which is the source of all grace and really the end of all creation. So his omnipresence is discussed in 8. In 9, his immutability is discussed and why it is that a purely actual first being can't change. And then in light of that, you've got discussions of eternity, which makes sense to understand how eternity is a single whole of actuality without any duration in it. He goes on to discuss then what we will about the divine names after that. He moves on then to things that I'm going to just skim stones over here and then incorporate. The way that God has knowledge, the way that life is attributed to God, the way that we can say that God has a will, the way that God then has attributed to him, for instance, justice, love, mercy. And then there are certain activities of God, his creation and his providence, his oversight of creation, that involve both his intellect and his will. And that whole section on providence and predestination has spurned entire debates in the 15th and 16th century. And even in the case of someone like, my semi-master, Father Garrigou-Lagrange, entire books just dedicated to the question of providence and the thorny and difficult issue of predestination. And then it closes the section with a discussion of potentia, or power, as it is said of God. And we may take that up if people have questions, but I'm going to end actually by reflecting on the divine beatitude, because that will give us a hinge point and connection for then our next set of discussions next week on God considered, or in 2 weeks, I should say, on God considered as triune. That the divine beatitude will function rhetorically, at least for us, to connect our lectures together. Well, there's a whole smorgasbord of divine attributes here, and let's be honest, there are more, right? God could be considered also the highest beauty. God could be considered he who is the highest wisdom. And there are many other names that have been applied to him scripturally. Well, how can we name God? Well, I'm going to begin by speaking philosophically, and then we'll carry this on in the light of faith as well, remembering that basically faith is going to elevate what we're doing by philosophy based on revelation. And so all of the various ways that scripture and tradition have revealed these names of God to us are deepened from within. But it's easiest to use the philosophical vocabulary, partially because that's how St. Thomas talks, but I'm going to mingle it all together here. So we've found a case of, the highest being. Well, God is a being unlike any other being. Every being that is created is a mixture of potentiality and actuality. This actually runs down through every single finite being, every created being. We have an absolutely pure case of existence. He who exists by his very essence. Any angel, any human, any lower creature, the essence of all of them don't include their existence. So what does this mean? I can think, to simplify it, I can think of human nature, that human nature does not have its existence implied within it. Now, there are very technical arguments for this distinction, but this is one of these simple cases that help us see it. In God's case, though, his very essence is his existence. Well, let's be honest. If we consider this first cause, we realize he's above all of nature. He is supernatural. This is the highest truth, actually, that we can reach through reason alone. That there is a first cause who is pure actuality, and then through a careful set of deductions, we can realize that if he's purely actual, he has to be a knowing being, because knowledge and also love are perfections that are pure. They are something that we can strip away any of their connection to finitude, and they can be pushed to infinity. Mysteriously, yes, because strangely here, we have a case of a being who is not only his thought, but also his or I should say, not only his ability to think, but is his thought. There is no distinction between his existence, his intelligence, and the fact that he intellects, we might say. He's self-subsistent thought, as some of the scholastics would say. Well, if there is a first thought, which would imply there's a kind of first truth, he who is the greatest of all truths, because in him, the plenitude of existence, the plenitude of being is present. That means that in him is a supernatural order of truth. I can't tell you anything about that supernatural order of truth. Every proof for God's existence from created realities can only tell us that he is one. It will never reveal to us, St. Thomas says, and also too his magisterium has had to clarify over time, God's triune nature. And while he has left his triune traces on creation, we need faith to see that. Reason, however, can say there is a first cause on whom all depends. He is the highest and most transcendent of beings, and indeed the highest of truths, always knowing himself. In him is a supernatural order of truth. In him, or he is the deity. He is the Godhead. The Christian will eventually be able to say, in that Godhead are the three persons, for example. Well, reason then at this point must abase itself and say, I will never by myself be able to know that, even though it would be quite wonderful. Indeed, it would be the greatest and most fulfilling thing to know that, if it were possible. But how could any creature know that God the same way he knows himself? This is called the obediential potency that we have through our knowledge and also actually our willing to grasp God in his inner mystery. But it's only a non-impossibility, because there's no way by our own nature we could grasp him. Well, the theologians would come to then talk about the mystery of the deity in himself. And there are many names that we apply to God. Let's just consider some of them. He is the highest being. He is the highest truth. He is the highest of intellection, thinking of itself. He is the highest of loving and willing himself by necessity, all eternity, and freely able to will any created being outside of himself with a sovereign freedom, because everything outside of himself pales in comparison to his goodness. But also, too, in relation to anything that he might know, he has a particular knowledge of that which he has created, but he has that knowledge by knowing himself as the cause of all things. So this is the discussion of the divine ideas that comes up in the Prima Pars. And those things that he has created, well, in them, the fact that he has created them is already a bounty that they never called for, because of themselves, creatures cannot demand existence and they cannot give existence to themselves. Creatures stand like beggars before God. And hence we can say, in a somewhat surprising turn of phrase, that he is the most merciful of ones, that mercy is a divine name. Indeed, as regards all of God's activities outside of himself, mercy is the greatest of his names. It is greater than his justice, for in every work of his justice, it first presupposes his merciful bounty. And we cannot meditate on this enough. Well, we've got already a number of names, and trust me, I've covered up some of them. There are things like his knowledge, or as some Thomists sometimes clunkily say, his science, but let's say knowledge. His knowledge of simple intelligence or simple understanding. He can know possible things that he has not created. Then there's also, too, his knowledge of approbation as well, involved in him as the cause of things. Well, all of these names and many others, he's the highest beauty. He also can be said to be the highest essence, and so forth and so on. Well, what do we do with them? What also of this name? He is he who is from himself. And I'm going to use that to help us understand this. This idea that in Aristotle, right, there's substance and accident. Accidents, for instance, if someone is virtuous, they have a certain quality of character. Well, there isn't just virtue floating around out in space, right? I didn't walk down the street and I don't see, virtue sitting out on my neighbor's porch, over there. I only see virtuous persons. Accidents, that which happens to things, right? So we could say non-essential attributes, non-essential entities, really. Accidents exist in substances, whereas substances exist in themselves as independent things, or quasi-independent things, for nothing is independent like God. We'll see this in a moment. Because we exist, for instance, as humans, in ourselves as a complete whole of activity, as a substance, a substrate, a hypostasis, a single and independent thing that can do certain actions, that can receive also certain actions from others. But we don't exist from ourselves, because we don't give ourselves our existence. We don't give ourselves our actuality. In fact, all actuality comes from God. Well, therefore, God has this trait of being a se. He is from himself. And certain Thomists, with whom I agree sometimes, even this is Garrigou-Lagrange, although I tend to poetically like his master's conclusion here that we'll discuss a little bit later, Gardet. The aseity of God is the greatest of these names. It reflects the fact that his being comes from himself. Now, we should notice this, though. These are the names that we give God. Ultimately, the greatest of God's names, and even Garrigou would say this, is, well, the unspoken name that God himself knows of himself, the deity. There is but one who can speak that name, and it is God. But as we try to coordinate these various names we give to God, the traditional position is being among these is the one that helps you understand all the rest. The God is the self-subsistent being, self-subsistent existence. Well, we'll go beyond being, I assure you, actually. But of these, to understand what sort of being God is, he is ase. The divine aseity seems to be the first of the names. Well, there's a temptation. I remember a wonderful essay by Maritain at the end of his life. I always end up referring to this stuff from Untrammeled Approaches. They're very difficult essays, but worth reading because he's so quirky at the end of his life. I have a very soft spot for Jacques Maritain. He's the reason I ended up becoming a Thomist. But he says there's a real temptation. The way that theologians talk about aseity, it sounds like it's a kind of wall. You've got this nice wall that is the divine aseity. And then we start plastering names to it. So let's just consider it. We've got the divine aseity, and then we also call that aseity, which is God, highest being, truth, intelligence, self-subsistent existence, intellection, willing, love, wisdom, free, etc. We keep sticking, merciful one. We keep sticking these names to aseity, as though we glue to the great wall of aseity, the divine names. This is not how it is, though. For according to the Thomists, God is utterly simple, and all these names are just, from our perspective, distinguished. Now, there's a footnote that I love to cite if anyone happened to buy my book of Garrigou's philosophical essays. It's around, I think it's page 350. I stuck a large chart on all the distinctions about the ways that there are distinctions among these names. if I'm going to gloss some of that here today, it's just to save the listeners to the main first hour of this lecture. It's a very important footnote, though, that I drew from other authors that I added to Garrigue's text because it's very important to see the point he's making. Divine simplicity, though, means that God is but simple and one, even though he's triune, and that all these names are different only because we are knowing them differently. Well, to understand here the position of St. Thomas, we have to accept the fact that his way of thinking about terms, concepts, intellectual operations or activities is very different than the modern way of thinking about these matters. There are deep dependencies on Aristotelian thought in modern logic, but it's quite different. And I think it's important to enter into what I think is the sane insight of Aristotle's idea of our intellectual activity. Here we're going to have to do a tiny bit of philosophy, but I hope that it pans out well. And I hope that it also makes clear for certain listeners things that they've heard Thomas talk about. So the mind has three principal activities, according to the scholastics in general, following Aristotle. We have an activity of defining things. So for instance, when I look around my office, I've got books everywhere, right? Try to define a book, right? You could say, a paper-bound way of communicating. So way of communicating is the genus, and then paper-bound, really it's just one difference. Paper-bound is the specific difference. That differentiates the way of communicating, because you could also have, a voice-bound way of communicating. And then you'd work that down into other definitions that could include television or radio or other things like that, podcasts. Well, those are the sorts of things, essences, that are grasped through this first operation of the intellect. Genus and species, properties and accidents are also highly involved here as well as we search for the definitions of things. Well, then we also form statements and judgments, right? So we say, for instance, all men are social. All men are rational. All humans, of course, all humans are social. Well, whenever we see that, we say, well, how do we know that? Well, okay. We then have to reason. It's the third operation. So draw conclusions syllogistically from one premise to another premise to a conclusion to connect two terms with each other through a middle term that they pass through, but that disappears. So let me give an example. Human beings are rational. Now, this presupposes that we've done our defining work already, because we need to know the subject and the predicate. But if we can presuppose here together, favorably, some general idea of human being and rational, human beings are rational and intelligent animals. Humans are rational. That which is rational is social. Therefore, humans are social. Because humans have a civic and political bent, but we'll say social. The notion of rationality connects human and social for us. All humans are social, or all humans are rational. Rational beings are social, and we would have to do all the arguing. That's the point of so much of philosophy, is to argue for that proposition. And then you can see, though, through the rationality, the connection between human and social. This is the nature of doing actually a science, is to try to find the linkages between true properties of things. Okay, so we've got these three operations. The intellect, this also is how we reason through how effects depend on their causes, and everything else is all going to go on in this kind of reasoning process of this third operation. Okay, so bearing all that in mind, just so you know whenever I refer to them, there are terms, ways that we associate a name with things. So, for example, we might, under a certain schema, define that which is an animal is a given being capable of sensation. So as long as it's capable of sensation, let's not worry about how to determine that. So we're not worried about, Venus flytraps versus oysters. But wherever there is sensation, there is animality. multiple kinds of sensation, not only, our external senses of smell and touch and taste, etc., but also memory, instinctual knowledge. All of this is a kind of sensation. But as long as there's sensation, you have an animal. That one meaning applies then to all cases of animal indiscriminately. That single meaning is attached to the term animal and is now applied with the same meaning to multiple things. That kind of term is called univocal. It has one meaning attached to the term going to many, many different things. Okay, now, the entire other domain is where that one term applies to many different things with many different meanings. On occasion, our language has, words that really have no connection. Maybe they do way back in the history of the language. You have to actually kind of like know some etymology. But an example would be, you see, there's a stupid example that's used in St. Thomas. It's not stupid at the time, but it's dumb today. Canis Major, talk about the dog star. And then dog. It's a kind of weak point. So let's consider instead bank. A bank is the edge of a river. A bank is a place that you go, to deposit your money, right? The term bank is used with completely different meanings in those cases, and they're not connected. In that case, you have what's called an equivocal term. One term, multiple meanings, unrelated. But then we can start pushing down into this equivocal category of terms and realize that this idea of having many meanings starts to shade. So we had univocal. In that case, one meaning applied to everything. We can't do this for God, we're going to see. We cannot say that the term good has the same meaning when it's applied to us and to God. Being doesn't have the same meaning when it's applied to us and to God. Love does not have the same meaning when applied to us and to God, nor does mercy either. For our mercy forgives the faults of others, but God's mercy is actually the root of his beneficence to create out of nothingness all things and to divinize all creatures and to forgive the sinner, to call them from the nothingness that they're cast into by their own sin, throwing them from grace. So this univocal is not going to work. But is it the case that we then would say our words are so weak that there's as much difference between good as applied to us and good as applied to God, that it would be like bank and bank? In that case, if there's no meaning connection between the words, you've got no bridge to have any kind of knowledge about God by reason, let alone by faith. Everything would have to be just because God said it so, but how could I even talk about God? You get into a problem where your language falls apart. If all of our words are equivocal when they apply from us or from creatures, created realities, to God. Okay, well, let's say it's like a metaphor. It's like a metaphor. See, because a metaphor is a lot like an equivocal term. So we use metaphors everywhere. I'm disappointed. I should have grabbed this book by Lakoff off my shelf before I started. It's a great book. I cite it all the time in these articles. People probably get tired of it. But it's called Metaphors We Live By. We use them all the time. Someone's bright. Well, no, they're not. Light bulbs are bright, but because light illuminates a room, and someone who's intelligent kind of is aware of reality, we transfer the meaning of bright from its original place to the case of intelligence. I'm feeling blue today, right? I'd have to actually go and look and see, well, why is it that blueness has become connected? But it surely is not because my soul or my temperament has become blue. You're going to see this all the time. He has a quick wit. Well, he's able to quickly respond to things. So that's a little bit closer to the actual meaning of quick. But still, to say he's quick on his toes, but you're actually saying that he's able to answer things quickly. Well, okay, that's a metaphor. There are metaphors all throughout Scripture for God. And they reveal to us something about God as well. They're not meaningless. We use metaphors everywhere. They actually structure sometimes the way that we approach reality. And they can be very dangerous if they're pernicious, leading us to actually treat other people as less than human or less than desirable, or even just to, misunderstand reality. But they help. We understand what we mean when someone is bright. We understand when we say that someone is quick on his feet. We understand what it means when someone is red hot with anger. Stay away from them. We understand what's meant when we say that, God is an impassable fortress. Or walk around all Zion. Walk about it and see its ramparts and its towers. This is what God's like. Yeah, he actually is. But of course, the light of faith takes those metaphors and soars them to the height and makes sure that we don't misunderstand them. But metaphors tell us something, but the meaning is not intrinsic in the shift. In other words, you're not going to take brightness and apply it to the intelligent person in all the same way. There's something going on in that third operation of the intellect that's retwisting the meaning and then helping you get a new definition that's associated with intelligence, to use a metaphor. Well, if that's the case, though, that still means our language doesn't actually tell us something about God. It means that our language is at best a kind of wordplay about God. Well, no, there are also analogous meanings. And here, I'm not going to teach St. Thomas as he's taught in the Summa. He's a little bit quick, to be honest, and even Cajetan, if I remember correctly. I only got to skim Cajetan's commentary on him, but says he's a little bit quick talking to beginners here. But there is a way that we can talk about things, and there are actually multiple ways to be analogous, where we see proportions that are related to each other. That we see that just as a created human is related to his or her existence, for example, so too this pure act that I've proven in my first way, for example, must be related to his existence. That is, infinitely. Existence or being, as applied to God, is infinitely higher than being as applied to humans. Humans are good to the degree, that they fulfill the measure of their acts, that they do human acts and follow the natural law and the law of grace. Or in other words, that they fulfill virtuous actions. That is how we can say goodness, above all, applies to a finite, free being. It's very different than to say that what is a good, shovel. A good shovel, it's not active. A shovel doesn't dig. It doesn't accomplish its own end. If it's good, it's got a good point on it. If it's a spade, and it's not cracked and it's hard enough to be able to, deal with whatever ground you're going into. But it's not kind of doing its own activity. But we can say that it's good, but it's a different sense. Goodness is said of an artifact, just as goodness is said of a free agent. And just as it's said of a free agent who is created, it can also be said of a free agent who doesn't have to accomplish his goodness, but is his goodness. God. We have artifact goodness, free agent goodness, divine goodness. There are others we could put in here. We've got proportions that are akin to each other, but they're in a certain order. The highest is God. Next one down is free agents. And then among the ones we've talked about, there's artifacts. That the mind's third operation, trying to give a kind of definition, but there can't be one, of goodness, realizes that there's an order in these meanings. These meanings are called, by strict logic here, analogates. There is an analogous term, goodness, which is known by recognizing that these proportions have a relationship among each other. And you've already had to prove something about God to, again, even be talking about God as this main case. He is the highest of goodness that never has to achieve its goodness, for he always is his goodness. And he is forever loving his own goodness. In fact, with an infinite love that will be reflected in the Trinity, as we'll see. But in any case, we have these analogous terms where you can't get rid of the individual analogates. You're always going to have to remember that there's this relationship between the many ways I use the term, and they're infinitely different from each other, actually, especially when you pass from created beings to God. So there are all of these names that we have for God. We can know God as the highest being. We can know God as the highest goodness, the highest beauty. But when we speak of these things, we need to order them. So for instance, St. Thomas argues this in the earlier articles too. In order to understand what truth is, you presuppose the notion of being. Interestingly, you can't talk about consciousness without first of all talking about being, because consciousness is a particular way of being. Knowing is a kind of being. Technically, you can't talk about knowing unless you've already talked about being intelligent. In us, we have an intellect that makes us potentially know. But God is just always knowing. So there's not much distinction. In fact, there's none in this one of the strongest ways between God's intellection and his intelligence. But all of these various names, God's wisdom versus his justice, God's mercy versus his providence, they are only distinct because there are notions or concepts that are distinct for us. How does this help us know God? Well, the way to understand this is God is so utterly perfect, so utterly one, so eternal and unchanging, that we can only come to grasp him through a sort of refraction of all of his attributes, of all the ways that we can talk about him. That the one pure light of God can only be gotten at, even through revelation, through many words, through many names. But in fact, all of these names, while they do truly apply to God, so we call God good because he is the highest goodness, not merely because he causes good things. He is goodness. And yet we're aiming at a goodness that is way beyond and above anything that we would be able to say with goodness in our created experience. This introduces a dynamic into our reasoning that is famously taken from Pseudo-Dionysius. St. Thomas draws it from the great, more than likely Syrian monk and mystic, a Neoplatonist, infinitely influential on both East and West, that we can know God through reasoning, through causality. We then, however, have to deny that God has whatever we're saying of him in a created modality. That God must be the highest goodness because he is indeed the source of all that is good, and he accomplishes the very perfection of his being. So that is what it is to be all at once good. But that's not like anything created. It's infinitely more than that. And each of these names, which take on a savor that's infinitely more mysterious under the light of revelation. So we sound like philosophers, but each of these names we've been given in the various revealed scriptures in a way that is poetic and yet utterly true. They demand ultimately to be united in something that is higher than them. That actually, it's not a question of trying to paste all these names onto that wall that is the divine aseity. Or as John of St. Thomas and Father Gardet said, the highest of attributes is the one that reveals it most self-subsistent intellection, because that's the most actual kind of being, they said. Well, it's not a matter of pasting it on whatever that highest attribute of God is. Rather, we should see that mercy and justice start pointing upwards, and mercy calls for justice to truly be mercy, and justice calls for mercy to truly be justice. And so too, God's knowing and the great resting that he has in his knowledge, that is his joy, the highest of his willing and loving, in the end, call for each other so that they may most truly be the highest intellection and the highest willing, if such perfection and such unity are possible. All of these divine names ultimately call to be reunited, formally and eminently, the theologians say, truly as what they are, but in a higher mode, in a loftier reality. That all that is goodness and all that is being, all that is knowledge and all that is love, all that is joy and all that is beauty, all that is science of simple understanding, and all that is mercy, and many other names that we give to God, ultimately converge in the Godhead itself, in God, the triune God, who alone knows that intimate reconciliation of these names in his eminent simplicity. And we can say, as St. Thomas draws to a close at the end of the De Deo ut uno, the On the One God, that God is ultimately utterly happy, for he has the possession of the highest good, for he is that highest good, and he takes utter joy in that possession. And that beatitude is what he will communicate. Yes, to the Son, through the grace of union. Yes, to all of those who are in a state of grace. Yes, to all creatures. But also, too, among himself, in those three persons who share this one beatitude. And so the divine beatitude becomes a hinge point between the treatment of the one God and the treatment of the mysterious way that one God is three, opening up from within the Trinitarian mystery, within the mystery of the one God. For they are not two separate Godheads, the triune God and the one God. They are instead one and the same great mystery, in whom all of these names find their highest and loftiest, simplest and most eminent, and most mysterious completions and unity. So there we have it. I will let Michael switch to questions.
Thank you for that, Dr. Monitor. That was excellent. There's a few questions that I have and some that I see in the chat as well. One that I was curious about, you were earlier talking about hierarchical change as opposed to, linear change that goes back in a linear succession. I'm getting tongue-tied here. You're talking about something that goes hierarchically, which, Dr. Fazer talks a little bit about. Could you maybe explain how this hierarchical change requires that for something to go from potency to act, that there's something there at the top that is pure act, i.e. God?
Yeah, I always find it hard to teach, to be honest. It's, it's hard metaphysics. This is the end of metaphysics. Yeah. But there's a temptation to think of causality like billiard balls, and you have to be careful about that. That's just not how Aristotelians are thinking of this. They're saying, as soon as I talk about just the notion of motion, which is going from potency to act, I could, in the sense of accidental causality, per accidens causes, that's where you could have back through history, this is happening. But when I start saying, essentially this change depends upon some other being going from potency to act, there's nothing that's explained about the very possibility of there being act at all in the sequence if you don't have some source of actuality. You're just going to continually say that essentially, per se, this alteration from potency to act is just referring to another potency to act alteration. And so, this does presuppose the discussion of motion in Book 3 of the Physics, how motion isn't self-explanatory. It's already calling for some causal explanation prior to it that's actual. But this is so different than a modern way of thinking of physical entities that it's boggling a bit to our mind, right? That it's a metaphysical idea of analyzing kinesis, abstract motion, and saying, I need actuality in this sequence. And so it could be, the whole sequence could be infinite, but you've not explained a single thing about how actuality got there. Mm-hmm. but it does take a kind of, you have to almost have a kind of metaphysical flash where you see that. Because I still sort of remember whenever I got that. When I was an undergrad, I looked at this and said, it doesn't make sense to me.
Right. Yeah.
So I hope that answers it. It's the normal, it's this normal sidestepping about per accidens causal sequences and per se causal sequences. Dr. Faser's book is actually, that's going to be easier to digest than Father Garrigou's book, and it's very good. Would be recommended to listeners who want to see that. But then there's also God, his existence, and his in his
attributes. I think
is a very good text as well.
Yeah, that's the one from Lagrange. It's God's his existence and attributes. That's the one you were referring to.
Sometimes it's that, but at least the edition I have here is God, his existence and his nature. It's just going to depend on. I don't know how they got republished, but it's that.
Yeah. Okay.
Two volume guy. Yeah.
Okay. Victoria asks, why couldn't the entire universe be continually in motion perpetually?
Yeah. Well, in a sense, St. Thomas is going to say that, you could have this,
right.
you could well have just forever the Greek mindset of, the eternal return. Still, though, the Aristotelian, and this is a big buy-in, I'm going to admit, so it's not like as easy as sometimes it's presented. The Aristotelian is going to say you still need to have some source of all that actuality, that it's not, act is not self-explanatory. Right. But St. Thomas is going to say the world could be eternal.
Yeah.
Basically, that has to be something that's revealed.
Yeah.
Because you could do that endless cycle.
He assumes it in one of his proofs. He says, okay, let's go ahead and assume that it's eternal. You still have to have this.
Exactly. It's like we'll presume that that's a possibility, and that's just going kind of horizontally instead of vertically trying to explain how did actuality get into the system whatsoever.
Yeah, he only accepted that there was a non-eternal world just because of divine revelation, to my understanding.
There are a few people who do sometimes try to say that he developed on that. I just don't get into those weeds. I'm not sure.
Yeah,
I'm not sure, and it seems like you should stick with the idea that it's possible. One thing I would note here, though, as we're talking about this to any listeners who may be less inclined than us to just take the conclusions. This is one of the reasons that St. Thomas says that revelation is necessary. This is the kind of stuff that would take you till you're about 50 years old or so to be able to know. And so we definitely we're more certain about this than our proofs probably even convince us of, because faith probably helps our reasoning here. That doesn't mean that it's not rational, but the elevation of the intellect through faith is really helping us here. Right. Very important to see that. There is such a thing as a Christian philosophy. So
I think not enough. Basically, what he's getting at is, the average person doesn't have the time to sit here and work through this, and some might not have the ability to do it, and then some might not have the time, and so supernatural revelation helps kind of give us a shortcut. But then we can look to reason and see that it is, it is reasonable.
Correct. But you're doing that already as having received it. Right. So it doesn't mean that it's not reasonable, but it's always important to see that dynamic is playing out in your mind.
Yeah.
So then you're often doing an apologetic answer is what you often are doing. And you should admit it, that you're using metaphysics apologetically is what I think. Yeah. Which is interesting. You see, I don't talk like a Thomist. A Thomist is very strong about this distinction between reason and faith here. And I'm strong about it, except I think we live within the context of faith quite a bit. But all of these arguments are objectively, these sorts of arguments would be objectively reason alone.
Yeah. So another question that I have for you is, why can't God be composed? Why must he be simple?
Well, if he were composed, there would be some kind of potency in him to begin with, first of all, right? Because what is he going to be composed of?
Right.
And so you're going to have some receptive element that's going to be receiving. Otherwise, he's not going to be the simple God that he was revealed to be. Yeah. If you have some, pardon me, whenever Father Christian comes around, if you have some splattering of divine names formally distinct from each other in the Godhead, if they're really distinct in God, I don't know how, I just remain perplexed how that doesn't blow apart the unity of the one and ever actual God. Now, the Aristotelian is going to say, because he's pure act, he's going to have to be simple, because there will be no shadow of change in him. And so you can't have any you just can't have any other. There are no other entities in God whatsoever, and so that's the end of that. Not a Palamite position, I understand. There's a Neoplatonic mindset that's going to be comfortable with energies that are somehow distinct from God as kind of radiances of God's glory. Those radiances, how can those radiances still be the divinity is what's a question to me. So
I guess my follow-up question is, if something is composed, it seems like one thing is in relation to another. It's related to another. Wouldn't relation necessitate potency to some extent? Relation?
Well, and this will be, of course, more of our discussion next week, because we're going to have to deal with the idea of the divine persons being relative.
Right.
So to be relative is to be directed toward a term. I mean, I'm going to have to go through and digest this really nice overview of this that I have as notes to make sure I get this, because technically that sort of being directed to another does not speak of any term, any potency. It just speaks of actually what the later scholastics called aditas, towardness. That's it. So to be directed toward a terminus is not actually anything that's potential whatsoever. It's just to be toward another. And so the Father is the towardness toward the Son, and the Son is, toward the Father, the relation to the Father.
Okay. There was another question here from Victoria at 631. Let me pull it back up. In what sense is God omnipresent? Essentially, yeah. And
so God is present he's present by his whole essence as creator. So that doesn't, this doesn't mean that God, this is this odd idea that God he's not really related to us. So let me explain this odd claim that really freaks people out. It freaked me out when I first heard it. What does it mean that God's not related to what he creates? I mean, this seems foolish. So Lord is a good example here. Think of the divine name Creator or Lord. These are other divine names that only apply to God insofar as creatures are related to him. Well, if something is related to another thing, that relationship is based on a foundation. It's based on some kind of similarity, for instance, between those two things. So because it's here, I've got two red books. The redness is going to found the relation of similarity between them, right? Well, if God were related to something else, he'd have to be related through his whole Godhead. Hence, relation is going to, if anything, only work for the persons of the Trinity. But creatures depend entirely for their existence on God, and so they definitely are related to him. And he really is the terminus of the relationship of creation. So things outside of him are related to him. Bring her question back up so I can make sure I can get there.
Let me get it back because I had another one prepared. Let me see. Here it is. Okay,
so God is present in the sense that he is the total cause of all of the existence of the thing, and he has to be present as the whole of himself and not anything else. But he's not present as though he is in creation. He's present as the principle on which, as a whole, that principle on which creatures depend. Now, he's actually also omnipresent in a different way to the saints, for instance, because he's present as the actual terminus of knowledge and love. There's something very different going on with his presence through grace. But he is present as a whole, as creator, to all that depend on him as a whole, to imitate his being in some finite way.
Present in power, I think is
present power. What is it? And it's actually
I think that's what he said.
Well, there's a threefold essence, power, and presence.
Okay.
So so he's there essentially through his power of creating. He's present.
647. Connor asks, does Aquinas assume that existence is an act?
Yes. Act. It is actually the highest of actuality.
Right.
That whereas for Aristotle, it seems like substance, is potentially the highest of act. Existence is the most actual of all things, which is very interesting because if existence is very different than essence. Essence tells you what something is. Existence posits it from nothingness. There's not content conceptually the same way about existence. So this is a very mysterious structuring principle. And one of the great Thomists to really just beat this home, almost like too much sometimes, but he's right, was Gilson. His book, Being and Some Philosophers, is a great history on this, if anyone's interested.
I guess you're talking here about, St. Thomas really highlighting the fact that there's a distinction between essence and existence, although not in God, but there is a
Yeah, in
distinction.
all created beings, there's a distinction
And
between essence and existence.
this seems to be something that it was implied before, but not really. People didn't really dive into that philosophy.
Yeah, like in it seems that form or essence is highest in Aristotle. I think you just have to say that. I can't buy these arguments that he's got it. Form is the high. It's form to be the highest form is what the first cause would be. Boethius might, if McInerney is correct, have had this. I tend to think he didn't. But Gilson said, "Did Maimonides, Rabbi Moses, the Jewish Spanish thinker, have this because of revelation pushes you toward this because of the great I am of Exodus." But this distinction between essence and existence really is unique to, I would say, at least the medieval Aristotelian, if not to St. Thomas himself. It's very structural for St. Thomas.
It may have been one of those, but I remember reading that distinction in someone way prior to St. Thomas. I'm just blanking.
Yeah, I mean, Boethius has these texts that sound.
It may have been Boethius, yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, McInerney is a good Thomist, so
Right.
I don't want to write it down. This is my bias. I don't get to talk positive of my teacher, Monsignor Whipple, too often, but he always was a little skeptical of that.
Yeah. Fair enough. Okay, it sounded like at some point in the lecture you affirmed that God is beyond being. Did I hear you?
Oh, yeah. So this is wonderful. I mean, he can't really be beyond being, right? Because the deity is going to be the highest of being, right? But from the perspective of our signification, that being is still incomplete. He is above being. He's above goodness. He's above truth. He's above goodness. Because in the deity, all of those are melded into one. And there's a beautiful text where, like, Cajetan says this, and he's usually known as being an Aristotelian, and he turns into a kind of Neoplatonist, that God can't really say above being. I can hear some people, already like the crackling of them burning themselves for me saying that, and then they're going to burn me. But being is realized in a higher reality that is the Godhead, who, yes, is the highest being by being the Godhead. And so, if you go with, well, even I can probably find this pretty fast here, actually. But ask me another question, and I'll come back to. There's a beautiful.
Did Saint Dionysius kind of affirm what you were saying? Did he hold to a little bit of a different position?
Oh no, he held it in a way that's even stronger than what I would say.
Right.
Like so much.
Sounds like it.
Yeah, he held it so strongly that God is beyond being, that you could have people like, Jean-Luc Marion who think that they're in the line of Pseudo-Dionysius doing what he is. It
sounds like he would affirm that God is beyond even divinity. Am I misunderstanding, or is that not?
Oh, no, you're talking about Pseudo-Dionysius?
That God, he's beyond deity. Is that wrong?
Yeah, that's understanding. I have to look at that. I mean, the text. I'm sure I remember something that is almost exactly that word for word.
Okay.
Yeah. And that's definitely the Neoplatonists is going to want to say that the unity that is God is so eminent and above everything. It's above. It's super eminent, super substantial. It's like super deity, in a sense. So that's going to tempt any Thomist. Because remember, St. Thomas is very influenced by Pseudo-Dionysius.
Yeah, but he doesn't seem to take that view.
Well, he doesn't in his text. This is true. I mean, definitely the later Thomists develop it along these lines, and you have to be careful because you're going to sound too much like Pseudo-Dionysius if you're not careful. But here it is, this text. Mm-hmm. So there's this question that Cajetan gets involved in about how do you have relativity of persons and how do you have the unity of the essence in the Godhead? And he's like, you're really wrong if you start thinking that there's this distinction in being that's between. There's relativity on one side and kind of unity or essentiality on the other side. So you'd have, you have to have, you're on one branch or the other, right? You're only one or you're only three. And he's like, no, it's actually the deity is a higher reality that has both of those in it. So if you can deal with a little bit of like Renaissance, scholastic language, we get to the end, it's just beautiful. And so However, we err if we go from absolute things and then from relative things and then think about God, imagining that there's a distinction between the absolute and the respective or the relative, as though it's prior to the divine nature, and therefore believe that the divine nature has to be placed either underneath one of those two branches. The opposite's the case, though. For the divine nature is prior to being and all of its differences. It is super ens, super unum, etc. It is above being, above one, etc.
Wow, I would have never thought he would have affirmed.
I know, it's great. Guy who was checking a translation for me of De Revelazione, he just finished it this week, and in the section he was checking, he saw that. He said, that's so pseudo-Dionysian. I said, that's why I love Cajetan. And that passage is why I named my first child after him.
It sounds like he's saying there's something above the Trinity, deity. There's something above the.
It's not above the Trinity. It's just the mystery of the Trinity is that the triuneness is un. Mm-hmm. So there's not absoluteness nor respectivity. It's both. Mm-hmm. Eminently both. Mm-hmm. All the persons are the essence. Or they aren't the essence. They are the deity. They are the Godhead. Each of the persons are God, but it's not as though the essence is the essence is the relations. We don't talk about it that way. So they all are the essence. So you see how I'm gonna have to work this out for next lecture to be very clear for your listeners.
Yeah,
you can feel the interaction that's going on between the persons and the divine essence here, and it's if you imagine the divine essence as one thing and the relations as though they are slapped on top of it, you're going to actually treat them like they're distinct from the divine essence. So somehow the divine essence is going to have to be in itself both essence and relations. So that's the point he's trying to get at there.
Seems like there was another one here. Hold on one second. It was at 649. Here we go. Are God's attributes absolutely synonymous, so that when we discuss God's power, we're also discussing God as he is in himself in total? If so, is God's act of creation also synonymous with who and what God is?
Yeah, this is what ends up driving Duns Scotus, for instance, to say I have to have a little bit more distinction in God so that this doesn't happen. This is kind of the classical nominalist position about the divine names. Right. I'm saying that God's creator, so his active or the active creation, God's act of creation is just God. Yeah. So if that's the case, can't I just switch my words? Anywhere where I would just say God, could I not say act of creation? Or could the classic case is, can I say that God punishes through his mercy? Or another way to say it would be God punishes through his beauty, or even more crazily, God punishes through his, oneness. This is the nominalist says they're all names that are they're all signifying one reality. But the meaning, this is what the Thomist is going to say, the meaning of the term actually is conceptually different. And so in our reasoning, we're going to have to use the meaning that we analogically apply to God in different ways. So there's still meaning that's applied to beauty, and we can't kind of just start playing around with beauty as though it's exactly the same as God's mercy. At most, you're going to have to do some move to show how it is that God's mercy also calls for his beauty, but that's going to be more than saying God punishes through his beauty, right? God punishes insofar as he is just, but his justice presupposes his mercy, which also in a way is a reflection of his beauty. That's different than just switching those terms out that way.
It just seems like if there's a difference for us in our minds virtually, there has to be some kind of distinction in God himself. I know you don't agree with that. At least I don't think you do.
They're all unified in one higher reality. I mean, I'd have to go and revisit all of those classical Cajetanian pushbacks on the Scotus position.
I'd love to hear that. If you can get that, this is stuff I haven't heard. I haven't heard his
the basic solution that the Thomists always say is that you're thinking about this. It's actually, you're importing kind of univocity. You're trying to get a single meaning that's applying to something also up there. Whereas there are ways that notions are held they can be held up in a higher notion. So, you can say that it's like here, that the highest case of being is actually the highest case of intellection. That's the easiest one for me to see, actually. because intellection is a kind of being. In fact, it is the highest mode of existence. So the notion of intellection can be just totally contained within the idea of self-subsistent existence, because it's a higher thing.
When you say intellection, I know that term to refer to whenever you see a universal, your mind extracts the particular out of it, and then you're able to see another particular, and you're able to recognize it. I mean, that whole process of the intellect. Is that what you mean when you say intellection?
Yeah. So yes. So that's for humans. That's what intellection looks like. It's abstractive.
Yeah.
But then, the reasoning that one can do when one talks about, for instance, purely immaterial knowers like angels, angels just know whole swaths of being with a single intuitive knowledge, that they've got knowledge that participates in God's creative knowledge of other things. And they look at, they have a divine idea of whole swaths of history all at once. And they know all the particulars that are contained in that one idea, but it's nothing that's abstract. It's more like how a creator knows the thing that they create. And that's what God's knowledge of creation is like too. God's knowledge of himself is quite mysterious, actually, right? What does self-presence look like for God? But God's knowledge of creation is not like God has an abstract knowledge of things. He has a knowledge of himself as creator, and then that's reflected. He knows all the various ways that he could create things. So the model would be like the highest case of a great artist, right? So I imagine Bach. God is really Bach in a certain sense, playing that fugue.
This one is from TSP. What would the doctor suggest in the is the minimum philosophical understanding one should have before one could understand the Prima Pars before reading it on their own? And also, thanks for coming on.
Yeah, what would help it's still a good bit of work. It's like if you want to have like at least some chops to do it, because I think it's important to see that this is not just easy to read.
All right. You
could consider, for example, there's a 4-volume set and you could skip the logic set, actually, probably on the whole, just skim it, but by Henri Dominique Gardet, H.D. Gardet. There are these manuals on philosophy that he did. They're very, very accessible. And if you can work your way through those, then you could really grab these texts from the Prima Pars. I otherwise would recommend actually going to Father Farrell's Companion to the Summa, and that first volume, and reading it, the Companion to the Summa. It's available online. Those are wonderful volumes. They're just so human. They don't get overly technical. I think very highly of them. I think that he had a deep and profound soul. He was an East Coast Dominican who died sadly too young in the 1950s.
How do you spell Gardet?
Gardeil. And they are actually, let's see here. Oh, I've got my stand right here. Where is one of them? Here we go. This is what I think the repubs all look like this. It was Whitf and Stock redid them. Introduction to the Philosophy of St. Thomas is what they're entitled. So there's a logic volume. Is this cosmology? That's a stupid name for it, but that's a different history lecture. But this is natural philosophy or the physics. There's a on the soul and then metaphysics.
Okay.
Yeah. Very clear. You have to work through it carefully. But it's just a wonderfly clear text, actually. Yeah. You see all my notes in here from whenever I read it.
Yeah, that looks good. I was going to ask you, is there a recommended reading list that you would be able to give us off the top of your head here for this lecture? Anything else, maybe?
Well, for more advanced readers, one might be interested in, for example, Father Thomas Joseph White's Wisdom in the Face of Modernity. Ignore what he says about Garrigou-Lagrange, though. Your listeners pointed this out. There's something that's really wrong in there. But Wisdom in the Face of Modernity is good. I hate to recommend it. My translations of Garrigou are good. The order absolutely just came out.
Sure.
Though, on this stuff here, just on particularly the analogy stuff, the essay on the eminence of the deity and my philosophizing the faith is good. The Garrigou text is on God's existence and his nature is good. Oh, Maritain has his lecture he gave at St. Vincent is not bad. He gave it in the 50s there on man's approach to God. And then there's what is it's lost on me. Phaser's proofs of God's existence. I really think highly of that text on the companions of the Summa for non-experts though. And then I'd have to think through that, because the issue is you get into all this stuff that's like scholarly work, and so it's just a wee bit tedious that way. Do you have thoughts? Do you have works that?
I have a question there about Maritain. Why do so many people put such emphasis on him? Why was he valuable?
Oh, Maritain was probably one of the great flowers, at least through the 30s, of the speculative line that came out of the Thomist school. He did lots of great stuff on epistemology and on moral philosophy. Just profound stuff. The Degrees of Knowledge presents the entirety of the theory of knowledge of Thomism from like the level of science in its modern sense, actually, and shows how it's related to Aristotelian notions of science, all the way up through what you have to have in human knowing to supernaturally have mystical experience. It's wonderful. And it's tied into the Thomist commentators. It's also, he's thinking on his own. He's deeply indebted to a lot of the conversations in the French world. It depends. Not all of his political stuff's as bad as the traditionalists say it is. I mean, some of it's got a little bit of wonkiness to it. His aesthetics are great. He wrote a couple of volumes on the theory of beauty and the theory of art that are just wonderful. Really great texts. I'm just looking at my list.
No, John Paul II loved him. I want to say his doctoral thesis was on him. If I was
his doctoral thesis was actually on John. Well, that one at the end was on John of the Cross's theory of faith under Garrigo.
Was it? Oh, okay.
It was Max Shaler. Max Shaler was the person that his other doctorate was on.
Okay.
So but Maritain's great. I mean, he's not just a popularizer. Some people say, like, not at all. I mean, I could just run through this text. I'd love to teach a class of like each of Maritain's texts, but the Degrees of Knowledge is a wonderful but very difficult text.
You mentioned commentators of Thomas. Is there anything like a short compendium that has just
yes. I've told this to your readers before. These are the two best. Look at me. I'm ready on this one.
Yeah.
Cesario and Cuddy's book, Thomas and the Thomists.
Perfect. Yes.
Yeah, that's a very good introduction. And then if you want to have a little bit of like, it's the same sort of thing, you can feel how they're related because Father Cesario wrote it. A Short History of Thomism.
Okay.
Yeah.
That has the commentators. Excellent.
Yeah.
Oh, that looks really good. I'm looking at it on Amazon. Well, I appreciate that recommended reading list. I think everybody else is also very grateful for them. I'm trying to skim here and see if there's any other quick ones. Here's one. What do you think of Jean-Pierre Torel's work?
Oh, yeah. I forget. I think someone asked me that, actually. It may have been you, Connor, online. I started having trouble catching up on questions online. So if that was you, I apologize. Torel's a very good historian, actually, of the work of St. Thomas. He's a little bit more of just pure historian, going back to Thomas and his sources than I am by bent. I'm a little bit more into the kind of speculative questions and the systematic questions, but he's very good historically. I'm actually going to be fixing up or like dealing with the details of the third edition of his work actually for CUA. There's a new edition of his overall biography of Aquinas, that first volume. So yeah, I'd highly recommend Torel's. It's sort of a general Thomas read. Torel is accessible. There's that wonderful little volume by Maritain, though. That's nicer just because it's not as technical and dry at points. But Torel's a good biography. There's also Weisheipel, Weisheiple, but that's Friar Thomas d'Aquinas, a little harder to find nowadays.
Okay.
There's a more technical one on him that just came out by CUA Press, but I wouldn't recommend that. But definitely Torel. Yeah, I mean, like I said, even though there's some Thomists of my bent who get a little worked up that he's such a historian, I mean, that's not a bad thing. So it's just that some of us like this school, and people from Terrell's generation hated the school. Surveys Pincares is like this in moral theology. He hates the commentators. And it took Father Romanus Cesario, as one of his former students, to get him to comment or to do an introduction to a book, to get him to read the commentators. So
I don't understand why some people just hate them so much. I don't get it.
I know. I mean, they are. I mean, they do get. They niggle over arguments. So anyone who read Scotus knows this feeling. Yeah. But it was necessary. I mean, there were actually later questions, and there were later problems. When you read Garrigue's commentaries, it's like things happened. So,
right. Yeah. Okay. Well, I really appreciate this so much. I look forward to the third in this installation of lectures. Can you tell us what we can look forward to in the next one?
Yeah. So next time we are going to dive directly into questions on God as triune. Right. So I expect probably some more interesting questions from you in that regard too. So we're going to do just the questions. Make sure I have them here. It's end of a long day. 27 through thematically 43 on the divine missions. So we'll be talking a little bit about the triune God within theology. And then maybe I'll just turn the discussion so that we at least structurally know what we're going to do. That last part I'm going to be crushing a lot into. So it'll be a little bit more of a smorgasbord. So
I have to ask this one real quick. This is such a good one. How do the exemplars exist in simplicity within God, but multiplicity out extra?
Yeah, well, so the exemplars, the divine ideas. Now, of course, I'm going to turn my hat to my former professor, Gregory Doolin, as well as one of my former classmates, Dr. Carl Vodder, who have done much more work on this. But once the idea of exemplars or ideas in God, things exist in God before being created. The word before, of course, is a little weird there because they're just in the divine eternity. Right. That all things are imitations, so to speak, of God. Mm-hmm. Pictures, we may think, they rely on what they picture, but the thing that is pictured does not rely on their picture. Right. So if there's an image of Maritain, for instance, that I have right here on this card, perchance, it's not as though Maritain looks like his picture. It's, I mean, in a sense, Someone can say that, you're dressed the same as your picture. But primarily, the picture looks like that which it is a picture of. So things are imitations of the absolute perfection that is God. That does not imply that God has in himself all of these different versions infinitely cutting him up. They're all infinite reflections of diminished sense of that perfection that is God. But God knows himself,
through himself.
And then by knowing himself simply, it's, you sort of have a sense of the richness. He has a sense of the richness of himself. I mean, our language fails here. And by knowing the richness of himself, he does technically know all the finite ways he could be imitated. And that's how you sort of work your way toward his knowledge of things ad extra. Excellent. But you have to see it as being like, these are things that are dependent on God as creative cause. So what's already going on here. Although his idea of possibles is still going to raise the problem you have, because there are divine exemplars of possible things as well. But that
ways in which God could possibly be imitated.
Yeah, but isn't actually, because he's not chosen to create that world or create those beings. And there's an infinitude of that, precisely because he could be imitated in an infinity of ways.
Right.
So God, in knowing himself, knows his infinite perfection, which implies that in an eminent manner that's beyond really what we can put into words, all the finite ways he could be copied. So it would almost be like, in a way, someone who really knew this is a bad analogy, but I need something, who knew Maritain at that age. The artist who knew Maritain at 20 could imagine all the possible pictures. I mean, a great artist does this, but we're so weak that like a great artist can't put it into words, but they see all the possibilities of what they can do to try to picture someone. So something like that, at least on the Thomist account. I mean, I'm not sure. I actually don't know what Scotus, for instance, thinks there. I'm sure he just blows divine simplicity up and doesn't care.
We'll have to get Dr. Goff on to comment on
Yes.
that.
Or Father Christian, yeah.
Yeah. Well, excellent. Again, thank you so much for coming on. I look forward to the next one. It will be in 2 weeks, also on a Friday, 6 p.m. Central. So everybody look forward to that. Any plugs that you want to put in for anything you're working on or your previous book, anything?
I'll actually plug just related to this, the philosophizing in faith. This was a text last year. If you're interested in the eminence of the deity, there's a really good essay in here. So I'll plug it quickly like that.
Perfect.
So.
Well, again, thank you for coming on. And everyone, thank you for watching. Thank you also for your participation there in the comments. If you have any other comments, go ahead, and questions, go ahead and put them there whenever this posts, and we'll see if we can get to it. Also, don't forget to comment, like, subscribe, share it on your social media, and visit us at it's patreon.com/reason in theology if you would like to support us. Until next time, God bless you all.